Hello everyone. I hope you're enjoying this event. This summit is wonderful to be here. My name is Irving Huerta. I am a journalist myself. I'm also an academic, almost by accident. Now I'm the convener of the data schools at the University of Cambridge. I'm also a lecturer in Bath University. But my heart's a lie, really, in journalism. I consider myself also always a journalist, and it's wonderful to be here. I also want to say that I've been in contact with One World Media for quite a while, always informally, always doing things and exchanging knowledge and stuff. Never really formally. So this is the first time that we have kind of a formal engagement. Partly because probably I'm Mexican, right? And there was something to say about Mexican journalism. But the truth is probably that they wanted some advice on how to get the best Mexican food in the other event in Mexico City. But well, that's me, and I'm going to introduce the wonderful panel because what the focus is going to be on them. So you've met Meera already. Probably I'm just going to say again that she's the chief executive of Internews Europe. So the rest of her biography has been explained already. Next we have Sam Bright over here, who is an investigative journalist and author. He is the UK deputy editor of DeSmog, climate investigations website, author of Fortress London, Why We Need to Save the Country from Its Capital, and Bullingdon Club Britain, The Ransacking of a Nation. And last but not least, we have David Nash. He is head of adapting to climate change, the Zurich Foundation. He has been involved first in training and development of people, moving towards facilitating partnership and organization development. And this has led him to think about how business can engage with communities. He has shaped and developed Zurich Community Trust India program, creating the partnership model with NGOs in South India. And more recently, at the Zurich Foundation, he has worked in initiatives such as the Zurich Flood Resilience Program and the Urban Climate Resilience Program. And we're going to be talking now about the role of corporations, philanthropy, and journalism, of course. And in a moment where also from Meera's talk, I take the line on climate change seems to be omnipresent everywhere, right? So it's now part of the conversation, but that also comes with a few issues. So corporations and governments, they always have a program, right, to talk about climate change, environmental issues. But now they spin it or frame it in a certain way. In journalism, that also happens. We have themes and we have talks about climate change, etc. But we are also funded by some corporations, or we are funded by certain bodies that want to talk to the public in a certain way about climate change. So, this is an important panel. And well, the way in which we've structured this talk is that I have a few questions. So I'm just going to address some of these questions to the panel and to one of them. And probably that person can respond, and then another one who's got something to say can add to that answer. And then we're going to have some time for questions from the public later. Okay? So I just want to ask Sam. So this year's COP was named as the Finance COP, right? An interesting time to be in COP. So now with the US election and its result, the middle of a conflict in the Middle East, what was the mood there? So you were there.
Yeah, well, excuse me, I got back from Baku yesterday, which is why I probably sound and look quite rough, so apologies for that. It was an interesting COP again. After Dubai last year in the UAE, which is obviously a petro-state, they then decided to compound our misery, our collective misery, and hold it in another petro-state. So that was very entertaining. The Trump question was interesting. I spoke to quite a few people about this, and they said the COP in 2016, after he was elected for the first time, there was a sense of terror that Trump had been elected, and foreboding, not quite knowing what Trump was going to do. I guess that is intensified to some extent this time, because we know what he did last time, and he pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, and he's threatened to do so again. But there's a sense, on the one hand, that because we know what he's going to do, we can predict it and we can adapt to it. So people know what Donald Trump is now. So there's not that surprise factor that we had in 2016. It's also the case, I think, that now, more intensely than ever, people see that the transition is inevitable. So if Trump wants to bring growth back to the American economy, as he's pledging, and let's not forget his best mate is Elon Musk, who is a climate denier on one hand, but on the other is an electric vehicles manufacturer, they're going to have to invest in clean energy. Renewable power is cost effective. It's the price of renewables as I don't need to explain to anyone in this room, has fallen massively. And so America will have to invest in clean power under Trump. Biden was also very smart in the Inflation Reduction Act, and he initiated a lot of those projects in Republican areas. And so a Republican president is not going to roll back on those measures. So the fact is, I think that people are a lot less scared about Trump and what he may hold for the climate than they were 8 years ago or so.
Very interesting times. I don't know if anyone would like to add to that question.
Of course you could add, but
probably not so diplomatic.
So, yes, exactly.
I suppose I now want to kind of explore a little bit on the things that you, Meera, were saying already about how we are covering some of these issues. So I just wanted to ask and probably expand a little bit on what have we learned so far in your experience about how to effectively report on climate change, particularly in the global south, and with the challenges that we are seeing at this very moment.
I think lessons are being learned all the time, and I think one of the ones I said about ensuring that the people most affected have a voice, because we have moved the conversation to mitigation and adaptation, and I think this is something communities are doing. The other thing, which in hindsight is we have pushed on a while ago, is really explaining regulation, the role of regulation in the sector, and both understanding what kind of big principles are being formulated on an international level, and also understanding that laws are mirrored. So if you kind of have regulation that's passed in the European Union, it's often mirrored in other parts of the world. And so then being able to explain how on emissions, for example, or food standards, and just being able to explain how this would play out in the rest of the world. I mean, just one very kind of trivial, small example is that Sri Lanka at one point hit a kind of massive financial crisis because overnight they banned all pesticides and insisted on organic farming. And they just did it overnight. And it hit the food supply, it hit farmers. But it was ahead of kind of a planned visit by the European delegation, the European Union delegation, but they assumed that's what they would want. So just an understanding really of knowing how certain principles in one area, what can work elsewhere.
That's very interesting to me. Can I just follow up on that? So this is about probably just focusing and reporting on one particular area, government. COP is just an international organization or an effort that is internationally concerted. So is there a way to challenge some of the things that are being said and done in some of these summits? I mean, in fact, Greta Thunberg was already very skeptical of COP, right? So I don't know if there are certain things that, some of these regulations that are probably going to be implemented generally. So is there a way to kind of push to that end?
Possibly, but I don't know if COP is the place for it. I mean, I'm not, COP is somewhere between an intergovernmental gathering and at the moment a trade fair, to be honest. Yep. And so therefore I'm not sure that's the space to kind of have these conversations. And I think it is something that other multilaterals, the UN, the EU, can possibly have more effective conversations on that.
Good. Thank you. So I suppose this one is about, for David or for myself or anyone who wants to jump in. And it's about which corporations and foundations are, I'm saying, leading or obstructing, right? The way when it comes to tackling the climate change, or tackling climate change. In Latin America or elsewhere where your experience lies, and probably can just talk about some of their experiences coming from a foundation that's at Zurich.
Sure. So One of the challenges, I think, with the whole of the climate question is which angle you're looking at the climate question through. And many corporations would say that they're doing quite a lot of stuff in the climate agenda. But at the end of it, it's largely around the net zero agenda. So what they're doing is they're decarbonising their own footprints, they're looking at their own supply chains, they're looking at the way in which they use power, all of that kind of thing, to try and understand how they can play in that net zero agenda. What they're failing to realise and do is a huge amount in the adaptation space. You take a look at the way in which climate is impacting people already. We haven't hit 1.5 over a 10-year average yet, despite the fact that we will hit it this year, from what people are talking about right now. That already is causing huge amounts of change that is impacting on people. People are being driven from their homes, people are losing their lives, people are losing their livelihoods. All of this kind of stuff is happening, and yet that's not the story. The story is not being talked about in that kind of way, because the story is being talked about in terms of what's happening in COP, and what's happening in COP is a drive for net zero and emissions and getting rid of fossil fuels and all of that kind of stuff. All of that is perfectly valid. We have to do all of that stuff to try and put a lid on where climate change is and to drive down global temperature rises in the long run. But in the long run is centuries. It's not what's happening right now, and what's happening right now is that people are being effectively pushed into very, very difficult situations. Look across Europe, for example, at the way we're handling the refugees crises at the moment, which are not particularly driven by climate. And then layer in the climate on top of that and the forced migration and displacement of people that will result from that. And you can see that it's a story that needs to be told. And when it comes to corporations, unless they're hearing that story, they're not necessarily going to invest in it. So a lot of corporations, you can see a lot of them going around talking about the net zero stuff, but they're not talking about adaptation. One of the challenges that we find from the Zurich Foundation's point of view, the Zurich Foundation has, I suspect probably because we're linked to the insurance industry, because insurance as a principle is about getting ahead of the problem and thinking about pre-preparing what's going on, making sure that we put in place things that enable you to avoid the disaster, make sure that it doesn't have the negative impacts because you've got some kind of way of dealing with that risk. We've been working on this kind of climate agenda from an adaptation perspective for the last 10, 12 years. We have a ambition for the work that we're doing at the moment, which looks forward for another 10 or 12 years. So we'll have done 25 years of this stuff consistently by the time we reach where we're going. And my view is it probably won't stop there because we won't have solved the problem.
And in your experience, corporations do jump in that idea? Like,
well, I
they join, or who are the ones who are saying
sure
yes for it? Right?
So I think I mean, as I say, there are a couple of organisations that would stand out in that space. AXA do and Swiss Re do, but we're talking the insurance sector. So the insurance sector, I think, in those spaces has recognised that it plays to one, their corporate strength, you know, what they do and what their skill set is, enables them to play in that space more readily. But outside of that, it gets really, really hard to get people to buy that challenge. So I wouldn't say there were blockers per se. I'd just say that people look at climate through a different kind of lens. They look at climate through this lens of net zero rather than anything else and say, great, we're doing something. You know, the climate agenda is really important. We've got to do something, so we're doing something. But that doesn't help to move things along. It also flows on into international agreements. You know, the adaptation agenda is very poorly represented. Only in the last couple of COPs has it started to get some momentum behind it, for example. So it's not an unusual thing that the corporate sector hasn't reached that point because you know it's not necessarily leading in that space at the moment.
Yes, thanks. And yet we do see corporations in particular. Probably I want to address this with a case brought by PopLab, our partner in Mexico City. Corporations are trying to adapt legislation and a few bits of regulation to actually take advantage or frame the problem in a certain way. Just want to cite this story by PubLab, Coca-Cola's tokens, and they have tried to influence public health policies to exert influence on this regulation, on regulations about, that's mainly health, but also climate change. In Mexico, they recur to signing of politicians to operate in their favor, to even fund some scientific studies or the sponsoring of government campaigns. Right? So that's something that corporations are doing. So on the one hand, they are talking about how we can tackle climate change and probably supporting a few initiatives. On the other one, they are driving how some of these issues are framed as well. So that's, I think, an important point. And probably Coca-Cola is not funding journalism, they're funding academic work. But I just wanted to take that example also to probably talk about some of the things that journalists we may encounter. And that is, yes, we cover climate change and we cover environmental issues. And more some of the money that we use to cover these issues come from corporations. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. We probably need some of those resources, but we also need to bear in mind some of the tactics that are employed to frame some of these problems. And just to cite three aspects of this kind of framing, something to bear in mind by academic Mel Bunce. So some corporations, some of this money that comes and helps us to do stories. I've taken myself some of that money to do stories, but we need to be careful about, for instance, how even if they're not really telling you what to do or what to write, the objectives of the news and the yardsticks by which the success of development journalism is measured, they're being changed. So what is considered good journalism, or even the amount of work, the extra work that you do to get some of those funds, are also having an impact in the practice of journalism. So that just kind of wanted to tackle that question of, well, what corporations are leading or obstructing the way in which we tackle climate change in Latin America and the Caribbean. That was my expertise in particular Mexico and other places of Latin America. I don't know if anyone else would like to jump into that.
I think there's something on why journalism. So I speak to quite a lot of foundations that are very committed to supporting climate change initiatives somewhere. And the conversation is, why is journalism the vehicle through which we try to achieve these other goals? And part of it is to do with the fact that journalism is very notoriously hard to achieve impact, measure impact. It's a constant conversation. How do we measure the impact of journalism? Going back to the conversation about advocacy, there's also this question of, should we be asking journalists to deliver on a certain goal or a policy change? Should that be the conditions, realistic? And then the other part is also a general bit feeling a bit scared. So it's a polarizing topic. So do they want to put their heads above the parapet and support independent journalism when journalists are troublemakers and might also be doing other work that criticizes governments in countries they're trying to operate? So I think that's where foundations look at journalism. I think quite a lot of them look at journalism, but quite a lot of them don't want to take the step of funding it because of that reason.
Yeah, I mean, DeSmog's in a fortunate position that it is philanthropically funded, and you wrestle with these questions all the time. And as you said in your keynote, it's clear. It's important to be clear at the outset what's expected of you by your funder, making sure that not too much pressure is put on you, or that certain objectives are being set of you, that they have a role in helping you to explore. And I think they've got to understand the fundamentals of journalism, what it's designed to do and what it's not designed to do. It's not communications, it's not public affairs, but I think that I'd say that there needs to be so much more investment in journalism from philanthropic organisations, because the way in which journalism can produce results in terms of its investigative output, I know lots of foundations tend to fund communications organisations and PR groups, and the fact is that those PR groups are using the material that we've uncovered as investigative journalists, and as you said earlier, we're very cheap. You don't need to put a great amount of money in to fund a whole investigative outlet like DeSmog. And I think that, yeah, there are certain drawbacks for sure of being associated with journalism in terms of foundations. It seems too much of a risk, but in terms of the output that you can produce, I'd say that, you know, we're the best investment around.
Thanks. I see. Did you want to say something, David?
Only to kind of think about the difference between investigative journalism, specialist journalism, and mainstream journalism. And I think that one of the challenges is how do you persuade corporations to start to take action when the majority of the time they'll read the mainstream journalism, but they won't necessarily go into the specialists or the investigative side of things to see what value that can kind of deliver. I'm certainly from the Zurich Foundation's point of view, our focus is firmly on how do you generate an impact, and measuring impact. You know, from a comms point of view is really hard, just generally, but taking the impact of investing in some material creation, now whether that's through research, whether that's through journalism, either could be used in forwarding an advocacy agenda, which could in turn lead to influence of change, which could in turn lead to some impact. That's a really long trajectory to persuade a corporate board, and largely the foundations are run by corporates and their corporations, who have a quarterly cycle of producing results. How do you persuade them that the 5-year, 10-year, 15-year trajectory, which you might need to be able to use those results to get the impact, is worthwhile having the patience for?
Yeah.
And I know that's a constant challenge that we have with my board. The investment in doing things in a long-term way is always there's always the pressure coming back of saying, so where's the results? Where's the results? Come on, tell me where's the results? And that's
not always can be
hard.
measured, right?
Yeah, you can't measure a lot of it, but it's just hard.
Thank you. I want to shift slightly, but going back to actually one of the points raised by Meera in her talk, and it was almost as you were looking at yourself, or we were looking at ourselves in the mirror, right? And you said this might be also that we haven't got a few things wrong in our reporting, or the ontological part of journalism. So this is what we are, and this is what we do. This is part of our practice. This is what we've done for a number of years already. And this might be problematic in itself. So I just was wondering, we can explore a little bit where journalists have failed, right, in covering these issues.
What are you looking at me for? It's a really interesting question, and I'd say it's important. I think in a room full of probably sensible, level-headed journalists who want to investigate, who see truth where it exists, to recognise that in the UK and across the world, a lot of journalism is not like that. It's actually the opposite. It's clickbait. It has an agenda. It's willfully distorting the facts in many cases. So I'd say I can speak from a UK angle in particular because that's my focus. But there are lots of publications, and I won't name them. Maybe I will. But you can. I'm sure you know them. That willfully deny the science of climate change, and they print it on their front pages. And there's a big question in terms of the media. How does the media investigate itself? That's a really difficult thing because we want to have longevity of career, and if you call out another publication, you're probably not going to get a job there, right? So we shrink back, and our social circles are often built around fellow journalists. But I think it's a really important facet of what we can do in terms of holding those publications to account that are simply not articulating the truth on climate change, and we've got to be brave about it. And that's a large part of our work, is in terms of trying to quantify the extent of the damage that is being done by these media outlets, and holding them to account and pointing the finger at individual journalists, and also just informing editors of the truth. I think often the news is in a hurry to produce the next story, and as a result, a lot of what the media does is not necessarily is not willful, is just ignorance or under time pressure. And so you can help to provide the facts to editors by just sending them along the facts, your latest story, and saying, why not commission something on this basis next time rather than something that's actively untrue?
Meera, do you want to come into that? Sorry, David.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I looked at you because I think DeSmog and the existence of news outlets like yours is kind of that you're there because so many other media have failed to cover these topics effectively, which is why, thankfully, the digital space gave a way for these kind of platforms to rise up. So it's a really good thing. And it's possibly a good thing that some of the media is losing audiences. So a lot of the kind of terrible journalism is not landing. No one's reading it. And the role of tabloids in Britain certainly is changing. So, they argue they're not anywhere near as influential as they used to be. But climate, again, I think we're now, literally in the last year or two, entering a space where people are literally looking out the window and seeing what's happening. So I don't think you can get away with outright lies when you can literally see the changes happening in front of you. So I think we will hopefully start seeing a sea change. But the reason it's failed so far has been because the media for a long time has not understood its audience, has not taken the time to really understand its audiences. So they don't go outside the capital in any country and look at what's happening in the kind of rural areas or even smaller towns in different parts of the area. They don't speak to people who have been adapting quietly to these changes for years and years and years, but have had no one come and report on them. So I think it's been a fault of the media to just, again, not look closely enough at what's happening.
I think David?
Yeah, and it's playing actually on a comment that Meera made in her speech about false equivalency.
Yeah.
I think there feels like there's a lot of pressure to be objective and as a result give credence to completely bonkers ideas and say they're the same as the completely sane ideas. And instead of actually calling it out and saying, well, there is a version of truth and there are versions that aren't true. And instead of saying, well, it's just a relative truth or it's your truth, which I think is a lot of things that happen at the moment. I don't know whose fault it is, actually. I don't know which kind of, whether it's media platforms themselves or whether it's just the prevalence of many multimedia platforms that are causing this idea that just because I believe it must mean it's true, so I'm allowed to say it and accept that it's true. And because you're trying to be objective, you've got to report that as if it was true. So I think there's a huge amount that we need to do to try and debunk the fact that some things are just not true.
Yeah. Building on that, there is such a concept as professional ideology in journalism, right? And this false idea of balance is one of them, right? You want to bring balance, but it's not really leading you to any truth. There is another one on professional ideology that has to do with the nature of news, and that is, well, what do we consider news? What do we consider a story? And usually what we consider a story is something that is dramatic, it is spectacular, it's usually tragic, right? So that can get its sublimation in investigative journalism. Don't get me wrong, I was an investigative journalist, I love investigative journalism, but sometimes investigative journalism is mainly focused on revealing the wrongdoing, and then we forget this other part that is also part of the kind of broader picture there. So we can make that mistake sometimes, right? Of just focusing on the super dramatic things, just as a note there. Probably going on to a more hopeful note, and probably we're going to have like 10 minutes or so. How can we then engage audiences on climate change solutions, right? Of what to do, right? I suppose the idea was, it is grim and there are lots of things that we are facing, but is there something we can do? And how can we keep these audiences engaged? I mean, part of the data that we also see is that a lot of people are avoiding some of these news, right? So what can we do then? As journalists, as people who are concerned about climate change, and how we can fund certain ideas to tackle it.
I think one of the things that when we think of climate is all doom. You know, we certainly in the climate spaces that I spend a lot of time in. You look at the science, and you know, we might as well all give up now, frankly. You know, we do it. We had a fundraiser at within Zurich a couple of weeks ago, where I started off saying, because it was all about climate change, this fundraiser, we did a pub quiz on climate issues, and I just said, "Welcome to the end of the world party," because that's what it is. It's we're all doom laden, but perhaps we don't need to be. And I think this is about how we try and shift the narrative from focusing on the kind of the runaway train that is being driven by the kind of emissions story, and start to recognise that there are solutions that we should be thinking about that aren't necessarily going to have an immediate effect on that runaway train, but are recognising the destruction it's leaving in its wake. So looking at that destruction and saying, how do we get out of the way of that destruction? How do we help people to move from that space? And certainly the interesting learning that we've had from our resilience focus, our thinking about how communities can be more resilient in the face of this climate change stuff, is recognising that it's actually just about good development. If you think about how communities are constructed, the way in which they work, the interrelationship between the multiple dimensions of a community, building out resilience is about strengthening all of that stuff, which actually means, you know, strengthening ability to get hold of good water, or to live well, or to not be flooded out of your home, or to have drought-resistant crops, or all of these kinds of things. There are solutions out there, and finding ways in which we can work at that kind of level and amplify the stories of hope that comes from that, I think can help to change the narrative to one where people are more hopeful about the future rather than less hopeful about the future. I think that in itself will help to generate much more interest in what it is. I think people do like looking and poking at the car crash, but ultimately they quite like to know that they survived, and that there's a happy ending at the end of it. And I think getting to that happy ending is where that solutionising can really take us.
I think that audiences are really leading journalists in this direction as well. I helped to set up People Fixing the World, the BBC podcast, and we did research there that showed that audience engagement with solutions journalism is off the scale compared to what bleeds leads journalism, which often pushes people away from the news. So I'd say that stories orientated around inspirational ideas and people are engaging. The problem is maintaining journalistic cynicism, that healthy skepticism that comes with journalism, is difficult when you do solutions journalism, because you want to elevate the solution and give it a platform and let it fly, but you have to think, well, nothing is perfect and nobody is perfect, so we don't want to give a disproportionate platform to something or someone who might fall flat on their face. There's also, I think, an important role we tend to do sort of villain-focused journalism at DeSmog. We bash the bad guys, right? And I think that's important in terms of getting those people and those solutions, the solutions of the fossil fuel industry, basically, out of the way, and debunking them, as you said earlier, to allow space for solutions to fill that gap. I think if it's dominated by the PR of the bad guys, you're never going to get the green shoots of optimism coming through to the surface.
Oh, sorry.
Meera,
I think she wants to say something.
I think just one quickly thing on cynicism and maintaining a healthy cynicism. Just because you find solutions that work in one space doesn't mean to say they're systemic, or that the system is geared up to be able to enable these solutions to be scaled to reach the literally billions of people who need them. So I think there's a skepticism about the system and the way the system works that you can maintain that skepticism with. That allows you to be focused on the good news story, if you like, the focus on the solution, but recognising that actually the solution's a sticking plaster until you sort out the system.
Yeah,
definitely. Meera, do you have a comment, or probably also an example of things that you've done?
I was thinking more about the point you made about mainstream journalism, investigative journalism, and I think who are the audiences? And so on one level, audiences are policymakers, decision makers, chief executives, ministers, who will consume one kind of media, and there is a type of journalism that will be important for them on these links between the structural issues. And then there's the audiences who are far more involved in the adaptation stories. I think that's one thing. And I think there's a lot that we've looked at reporting uncertainty, because I think journalists are really bad at reporting uncertainty. And the climate story is all about uncertainty. And when we have solutions journalism, we want, we found the solution, there you go, that's it. And when it turns out not to work in a slightly different circumstance, it's like, okay, that's failed. Rather than saying, no, we try something, and it's the scientific method.
Yeah.
You know, we try an experiment and then you learn from the results. And that's, journalists are shockingly bad at doing that.
Yeah.
And I think in climate journalism in particular, we really see a really need to think how we report on science, how journalists interact with scientists, what scientists are allowed to say to the media, and how their message is then transmitted, because I think a lot of scientists are very unhappy about the way their research is presented once they speak to a journalist, and then also really educating audiences on what it means to report on uncertainty. It doesn't mean you were wrong. It doesn't mean if you said something and the reality is different, the next day it's wrong. This is part of the learning process.
Yeah. I'd just say as well, we have the solution, right? Like, renewables are the solution. Like, they've been tested. They are very cheap now. It was really interesting. I went to a panel at COP where the Iranian Renewable Association was there. And they pulled up some fascinating data which showed that despite renewables only being 0.5% of the energy mix, I think, in Iran, really tiny percentage, because Iran's obviously a massive oil and gas producer, you could still run Iran's energy supply, 90% of it, over 300 days a year from renewables.
Wow.
The countries that are oil and gas exporters are most adapted to rolling out renewables. Even now, if Iran did it, it could cover its whole grid on renewables. And I think that's a fascinating and brilliant source of hope, a story that we can tell. The problem is, as you say, renewables are they've been around for ages. Like, we're constantly in search of, like, what's the new thing? What's the new hack? When actually what's probably most effective in terms of bringing about change is finding new ways of telling that same old story of, like, how are wind and solar going to be able to fix this problem.
Thanks. I have a last question that is actually very connected to what we've already said, but I wonder if you can just respond to this question with a story or with an example that you may have from your own, bag of stories, right? So what role can journalists play in helping inspire more corporations or philanthropists to take action in fighting climate change?
What role can journalists play? I'd almost say that's not a role journalists should play, to be honest. I don't think it's up to journalists to try and persuade corporations to take action on climate change. I think, Good. I think telling this, I think journalists can play the story of saying why we're all doomed, basically, if this action isn't taken, and here's some ideas, but I don't think it's up to them to change the minds. They're not.
Yes, and is there a way in which you then use a different angle to affect change? Or in your experience, a story or an example of that?
I'm going to try and think about what you mean. I think we have case studies of supporting journalists who report on, giving story grants to journalists to enable them to report on an issue that's then fed into the policymakers and then debated in Parliament and affects change. And this has happened in work that we do in India, for example, supporting Indian journalists. So it's giving the journalists resources that they wouldn't have otherwise had to do the reporting they want to do, and then tracking how the story plays out through the political system. And one thing we do tend to do is say, these are the things you need to cover in order to grab the attention of the decision makers. You need to make it an issue that people are going to vote, going to affect people's voting behavior, because it's this particular thing. You need to kind of put in statistics and data that can be used by people who are then trying to argue your case in Parliament. So I would say it's like that, but
I suppose you want holding them accountable rather than inspire.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So I suppose that's where the tension lies.
Yeah, I can provide an example that we crow about all the time in our funding reports, but it's kind of looking at it from a different lens in terms of how to hold people account effectively that then brings change through the system. So obviously, as we know, heat pumps are a great clean heating solution, right? But they're part of the culture war now, particularly on the pages of some tabloid newspapers. They hate heat pumps for some reason. And we kind of tracked... And we saw this trend, like lots of opinion pieces, lots of news stories, really bashing heat pumps. And we thought, heat pumps aren't that interesting, right? Why do they want to write so much about heat pumps? And we found examples of material on a PR firm's website where it was boasting about the fact that it had been paid by gas boiler lobbyists to spark outrage about heat pumps in the national media, and had placed a bunch of stories essentially saying that heat pumps are bad. So a confected, contrived campaign, right, to bash heat pumps in favour of gas boilers. So we highlighted this story, and through some of our contacts in the civil service, we found out that the gas boiler group that had funded this campaign was hauled in front of ministers after we published our story, and the government, this was the previous government actually, said, we're severing ties with you. We're not talking to you anymore while you do this sort of misinformation campaign. So I think that's a really, and you rarely see that. Yeah. You were talking in terms of impact. You rarely see how your journalism has affected those in power, has caused certain decisions to change, and how it's caused a backlash against those corporations, against those PR firms that have been involved. So for me and for us, that really sustains our journalism, that hope that you can have that direct route from story to political action. At times a lot of stories don't have that. So where there's one example, we like to talk about it as much as possible.
Yeah. Political action is just something that returns us to objectivity, right, and where the lies of social justice lie. David, you want to say something?
Only not from the point of view of offering a story, because I think they are actually quite hard to pinpoint, but just more in terms of how do corporations get more persuaded to get more involved. And I don't think it's the role of journalists to persuade corporations to do that, but what would trigger a corporation to make a decision about whatever it does? And ultimately it's economics. So the power and understanding of why it is economically in the corporation's best interests to pursue a particular line encourages them to pursue a particular line. And I think this is one of the reasons to hold out hope for the next Trump presidency, and that kind of view that the renewable bandwagon is almost unstoppable from a purely economic point of view. It just makes no sense to keep investing in fossil fuels from that perspective, and so it won't roll back in the same way that it might have feared in the previous times. And that's the kind of example I think you'd use in the corporation sense as well. Is if we tell the right story about the economics of it.
And I would actually argue, I think the insurance sector could play a really key role, because it would be really useful for the insurance industry to say, these are the rising costs, and be really explicit.
Absolutely.
These are the rising costs.
No, absolutely. And in all honesty, they do, in the sense that there are organisations of insurers in the US on the West Coast that simply do not insure for wildfire any longer. And what that's doing is it's not saying it's uneconomic to insure for wildfire, and so we're making an economic decision. It's sending a price signal to say this needs to be tackled. We need to do something because it's unsustainable.
Interesting. Now we need to open it up for a Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments, please do raise your hand and let us know. I think we have a question over there.
Hello. So I was watching an interview yesterday from a lady, I can't remember where she was in the Caribbean. She was saying that there was money that was being given to her government to mitigate the effects of climate change in that region, but that she felt that it wasn't being disseminated because of corruption. And she was saying that she'd basically given up on the public sector and that the private sector was her only hope. So I was thinking, it's clearly extremely important topic, and I just wondered about your optimism. Just get a litmus test on whether you're optimistic that things will get better, or pessimistic that it will take a few more disasters, for example, before people start doing the right thing.
I think corruption is, and corruption in development and public sector corruption is a kind of endemic issue in many parts of the world, and journalism obviously plays a key role in helping investigate that and uncover that and hold that kind of money to account. The pessimistic, optimistic, I think, again, it's obviously there is huge upheaval coming for all of us, and that's the source of deep pessimism, because I think something's going to be inevitable, but also some optimism in that we cannot continue to ignore it. It just won't be physically possible to ignore it.
Yeah, and I'd agree that it's not physically possible to ignore it for much longer. I think the reason that I'm relatively optimistic is not necessarily because of the corruption. I think that there is corruption around in lots of different spheres of life, and the climate finance will be not immune to that. There's always going to be some of that around. I think what's more worrying, but what also gives me some optimism because you can pinpoint it and see it, is the process of dissemination of money. So when you take a look at the way in which, for example, the Global Climate Fund disseminates money, it takes years from a decision to actually distribute money to a place for it to reach anywhere near the place it needs, and it never reaches the ground. It kind of lands up in the middle of an international agreement somewhere, but doesn't actually make it down to the last mile very easily. But that's fixable. That's about process. That's about understanding how the process can come. So that's where I have optimism that public sector money can flow in the right kind of way. I think it's also definitely feasible that the economics will become so powerful that it is an incentive for private sector to act. I think we just need to make that case much more strongly in order to make that happen.
I'd also say, just briefly, definitely not just developing countries where corruption is an issue. I mean, a recent example from the UK is carbon capture funding. The UK has committed £22 billion worth of carbon capture subsidies over the next 25 years, when we know that carbon capture is not the solution, it's a distraction. And we can see the lobbying. That basically all that fossil fuel companies want to talk about is carbon capture and hydrogen, right? And yet our governments are just splashing the cash quite liberally on carbon capture. So we've got to be mindful of the ways in which fossil fuel companies and developed countries are claiming they have the solution when they don't, when they're just articulating and implementing the solutions that have been given to them on a plate by the fossil fuel industry and their powerful lobbyists.
We've got a question over here.
Hi, and I wanted to come back to continue this to talk about funding, because I think funding, we have to follow the money now, because that's the problem for nonprofits that work in climate and social justice, for example. So I'm a journalist that went to the social impact area. And there are two things on this. One thing is that how you can fund in a way that is consistent so you can really see social impact. Because the situation is ESGs and everything now, how you do this in a consistent way that is not greenwash. Because that's the problem. Everyone now is going to copy to do green activations. In Baku, for example, Dubai was the peak of this. And then, in fact, that's not a solution, because what as a journalist, that my situation is, sometimes when you see something very optimistic in climate, we can end up in greenwashing. That's one thing. And then another thing is what you said about how this money goes to local organizations rather than to big organizations that, in fact, spread the money. So, for example, I know that they do amazing job, Greenpeace. But the money that they use in the Amazon don't go necessarily to the people there, or for the people in the Amazon to have more agency. That is always this thing that we always have to do something that they think that's good for in their context. So how international fund can go to local organizations, because they need this money to go against what the government is saying.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, we're part of, and in fact, the organisations we work with as part of the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance are all part of signing up to the principles of locally led adaptation. So thinking about how we will work to push money as far down the chain as possible, because ultimately you can't change people's lives for the better unless money gets down to the local level. It's the last mile that's the missing link often. And I think corporations do have a role they can play in that, perhaps more easily than the public sector does. I mean, public sector tends to, and kind of giant ODA kind of funding goes government to government and then gets stuck, whereas the private sector can literally make a choice about where it goes and decide to go and fund at a much more local level, usually through intermediaries to make sure they've got the due diligence processes in place to understand and be able to follow the money, rather than just very, very small organisations on their own. But following that money down the track is something that I think corporations can do well. It's something that is difficult for corporations, and particularly in the social space. Social impact is not the work of a 3-week or a 6-month cycle. It's the work of potentially years and decades. So you need to have a board within the kind of corporation that has a longer term outlook on these things, and the patience to let things develop. And I'm fortunate within the Zurich Foundation that we do, that we've been able to do that over the last decade or so.
Can I have a follow-on question on that?
Of course.
Holding government account to account will be probably easier with transparency laws and etc. So how do we hold corporations if they are spending this money?
And I think that's an exceptionally good question. And I think that the challenge is that and to your point about greenwashing, I think the challenge is that nobody does hold corporations to account in that same kind of way. They see what looks like positivity and they report it as positive instead of actually being able to delve under the surface. And I think that is potentially a role that journalists can play, is to try and hold corporations more closely to account. That's difficult when you get certain lobbies and around the place to be able to hold them to account because they're very powerful.
True.
That's hard. We try and be as transparent as we can be. So that's all I can say.
Yes, we have 5 minutes for final question, I suppose. Yes?
If you stretch, nice stretch. There you go. Thank you. Thank you for this panel. It's super interesting. So I'm a political ecology student. I just graduated from SOAS University, and some of the questions that we talked about this year was also about the intersectionality of environmental change and climate change, not just from like the CO2 emissions, carbon tunnel perspective, but also intersected with inequalities based on race and gender. And one of the things that I think is especially worrying now is not just the greenwashing agenda, but the eco-fascism agenda. There's countless examples of this. Recently, I mean, where I come from in France, a lot of like journalism schools are being bought back by far-right backed media. There's also a lot of, I mean, even with the genocide in Gaza, what's happening is like the government of Israel, like I read an article about this, of how like they're using sustainability as a way to like kind of promote new construction agendas in the south of Gaza. And so like I think, how do you address this intersectionality to have maybe an impact not just on like policies but also on like voter turnouts and ensuring that people are knowledgeable about the far right and their intentions and what they invest in as well. And you were talking about following the money, and I think that's like super important as well. So
I think it's important to expose the contradictions of those forces. So we do a lot of work in the UK looking at our favourite politician, Nigel Farage, who just won't go away. And obviously he has a constituency now in Clacton, which is a coastal community. And his constituents are more exposed than a lot of the country to the effects of climate change, to sea level rises, to flooding, etc. So I think, to a large extent, it's classic boots on the ground journalism. Like, go to Clacton, speak to people, map exactly how the constituency will be affected, report on that, question Farage about it, get other politicians to question Farage about it, bigger media outlets when he's on broadcast to question Farage about it, that sort of thing. It's interesting as well because I think they're using environmentalism. They're misappropriating it because they know that their constituents actually care about it. Farage isn't like this. He's a denier. He's out and out. He said CO2 is plant food. You know, it's just off the scale. But in Hungary is a really interesting example because Orban at home projects environmental authoritarianism because there have been massive floods, because his rural voters know that this is an existential issue for them. But abroad, he's a climate science denier and he funds lots of projects to propagate climate science denial in the UK, in the US, etc. And I think it's about understanding and mapping that mindset to then pull apart the contradictions in their various views and then hopefully debunk them, would be my thought.
Like a word on intersectionality, tackling chemical change?
TikTok-sized responses, by the way, 60-second, quick, short.
So only from the perspective that resilience is about development, and that means it's about all of the issues that you mentioned. So it is about climate change is gendered. It is about social equity. It is about justice. It is about all of those issues that are affecting people at a social level, because those the reason you're not resilient is because of all of those factors. All of those factors play into it. It's not just about concrete on the ground and making sure you've got insurance policies. It's actually much, much wider than that. Those two things can help in the right circumstances, by the way, but it is that wider issue.
Okay, thank you. So we've explored the role of corporations, philanthropists, journalists in tackling climate change, holding them accountable, inspiring or persuading, right? And just want to thank the panelists. Thank you as well for this talk.